I've spent 54 years studying Lewis and 44 years teaching on Lewis. Most of my books are on C.S. Lewis, and the only people that buy them are anesthesiologists because they found that they're cheaper to prescribe than the drugs and hold people in a deeper sleep longer. But I feel like he's got 73 books. He wrote 56 in his lifetime. The rest he wrote after he died. No, they were essays that were collected that would have been lost had they not been brought together under common cover. Walter Hooper was the man who did that. And I've read every one of those books many, many times. And I'm interested in the fact that Lewis opens more than wardrobe doors. You go to Lewis and you want to read the books he describes and talks about, and he takes you everywhere. And it's an exercise of great awe and wonder for me, but we'll talk more about that. Bruce Edwards, who I thought was the greatest C.S. Lewis scholar out there, he passed away several years ago, but he said the whole academic enterprise is to see patterns and exceptions. We look at the particulars and we try to abstract from them so that we can pass on a body of knowledge. But if we don't account for the exceptions, then our abstractions are falsehoods. So there's this tension between seeing the particulars and abstracting. I'm going to abstract today. I'm going to take from what I've seen in Lewis, and I've been asked to address this in light of what can academics today learn from C.S. Lewis. When the topic was first given to me, it was, if C.S. Lewis were alive today, what would he say? Nobody can answer that question. Whenever anybody tries to answer a question like that of some author, they use the author like a ventriloquist uses his dummy and mediate their own ideas through that person. But let me see if I can abstract, and let me see if I can give you some things that might be helpful in your teaching. First, I think academics can have reinforced what sound academics should always know. Lewis had no corner on sound academic practices. He did provide, however, a noteworthy embodiment of them. His writing is characterized by humility and authenticity. He knows what he doesn't know, but he knows a lot. And we'll pick that up later. He stays in his lane. He doesn't try to go outside, but he does try to be a faith-integrated author. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But the case in point would be English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. One of his books he wrote. Took him 18 years to write it. He wrote it for the Oxford History of English Literature. It was a burden for him, so he called it his Oh Hell volume, Oxford History of English Literature. To write that book, he read every book written in English in the 16th century. Incredible scholarship. Not only that, he read every book translated into English in the original language it was written, Old Italian, French, Latin, and in translation. So if he made a judgment about it, his judgment would be an informed judgment. So many times we can be tempted as academics to make judgments that are a little bit beyond what we've actually studied. Lewis embodied sound academic practice. By the way, in that particular book, English Literature in the 16th Century, it's a blast to read. It's a 600-page book, and I think, it's actually 700 pages. But you'll laugh your way through it. Lewis brings such humor to his academic work. There's clarity, humor, and so on. But in that book, there's a whole section called the Age of Religious Controversy. 16th century was the century of the Reformation. Lewis said, I am not a theologian, but he did better reading than most theologians have done. He read every book that came out on the Reformation. And his judgments, because of this, are nuanced. He's not making any kind of judgment against the Catholics or the Protestants per se. He says this, that the Protestants thought the Catholics were Pelagian. And the Catholics thought the Pelagians were antinomian against the law. He said both were wrong. Both were wrong. You could find a Pelagian among the Catholics, and you could find an antinomian among the Protestants, but you had to bottom fish to find them. You want to find out how good your ideas are? Go against the best of the other side, not the worst of the other side. And Lewis is a person who wants to go against the best. He also said that even the Bible translators at that time were using one another's translations. Those working on the Douay Rheims and those working on some of the English translations. Tyndale and Coverdale and so on, they were actually benefiting from one another's work. And it's something that people usually forget because we're so quick to project on the other side. In An Experiment in Criticism, it's his mature literary critical work that he wrote towards the end of his life, he said, in coming to understand anything, we must reject the facts as they are for us in favor of the facts as they are. So there's an academic honesty and humility and authenticity in his writing, and I think all academics should benefit from that and be conscious of that as we do our work. Second, academics can learn from C.S. Lewis a rhetorical style. Lewis even said, I'm a rhetorician. He also said, I'm an Irishman, so naturally I'm a storyteller. But he recognized as a rhetorician that the key feature in rhetoric is that it should be audience-centered. He sought to understand his audience. Even if you've read Mere Christianity, he begins, have you ever been in an argument before? And he brings out common experiences and begins his argument from common experiences, appealing to his audience and then building his argument that way. And Lewis's rhetorical posture, as I read him, is he doesn't get in the face of the person he's talking to. He seems to get shoulder to shoulder with the person, and he defines and describes the topic that he's concerned about. And he describes it and defines it in such a way that we get interested in it. And when we put him down from reading, we're still interested in the topic. And I think this is really important. I'm afraid that oftentimes we don't teach wonder to our students. And I'll talk to students and I'll say, have you ever read Dante? Well, when I was in college, I read part of the Inferno, you know. And it's almost like their academic education has inoculated them against reading. It hasn't created wonder. Seems to me if you've read Dante and you've read it well, you'll go back to it. I've gone back to it many times since college because it's a fascinating book, and every time I read it, I feel like I bring more to it and I also get more out of it. And so Lewis wasn't that way. He was a rhetorician who awakened in his students a sense of awe and wonder so that they became fascinated with the subject even long after he was gone. And I think too, I don't know if any of you ever read Richard Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences. Do you know this book? And do you know the sequel to it, The Ethics of Rhetoric? So Weaver was a rhetorician at the University of Chicago. And he looked at levels of rhetorical argumentation. The highest level is the argument from definition. And here again is Lewis. What we're supposed to do is define and describe. Maybe depict, use an imaginative depiction. Lewis would often write in propositional language one book, and then he would depict it in imaginative language. You got the Four Loves, where he's describing love, and then he's got Till We Have Faces, where he depicts what this is like. He's got The Abolition of Man, where he's talking about truth and objectivity. We'll talk about that book in a minute. But then he does That Hideous Strength, which is the imaginative depiction. He writes an autobiography talking about his conversion to faith, Surprised by Joy, but then he does an imaginative depiction of it in Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romanticism. So he's given both sides. He's appealing to head and heart and so on. But Richard Weaver, in his book, The Ethics of Rhetoric, says that the most ethical form of argument is the argument from definition. I'm arguing from something. And I can infer from that definition and move an argument along and come to a rather convincing conclusion. And if I go off the rails, I can still go back to the definition and appeal to that and get back on track. Argument from definition is the most ethically rhetorical argument. But sometimes I can't get to a definition. The word definition means of the finite. We define a thing by its limitation and function. It has to be small enough to wrap words around it and distinguish it from other things. So how do you define God? If he's infinite, he breaks a category. So the second form of ethical argumentation is the argument from similitude. And Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven. How do we get our minds and our language around that? He says the kingdom of heaven is like. He uses simile, metaphor, figures of speech, parables, and so on. So that's the second form of ethical argument. The least ethical form of argument is the argument from consequence. If you vote for my opponent in this next election, whole world's going to go to hell in a handbasket. There's no reality that supports that claim. It's all supposition. And so it's basically manipulative. And it's where, I don't know how it is in your countries, but in our country, most political rhetoric settles in the argument from consequence. It's really bad. The last form of argumentation, he doesn't give a value to. He says it's a form that we use. And it's when we don't know how to argue, so it's the argument from authority. We just quote somebody else, or we produce a book like the Quotable C.S. Lewis or something like that. That's a joke. I did the Quotable C.S. Lewis. So anyway, Weaver is helping us understand why Lewis is effective as a rhetorician, but basically it's he gets shoulder to shoulder. He's fascinated by the things that has attracted his attention. He describes, he defines, he depicts. And I think as academics we should do that in the hopes that our students, years later, we could say, hey, what do you think of Dante? And they could say, wow, I just went back to it recently. Or what do you think of Chaucer or Shakespeare? Or what do you think of Homer? Or what do you think of Plato or Aristotle? Lewis himself opens again more than wardrobe doors. He was my liberal arts education, reading him and reading the books he refers to. Third, academics can learn from C.S. Lewis an objective approach to truth. An objective approach to truth. I'm shocked. I teach at Wheaton College, or I taught at Wheaton College. It's a Christian liberal arts college. Some people say it's the Harvard of evangelical colleges in America. I don't think they say that anymore because Harvard's kind of unraveling. But nevertheless, it's a great college. I think that we're a good college because students are attracted to it, and it's because of the students we get. I think we've got good professors there, but our goal is not to mess them up too much. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, I will say to 100 students, can you define truth for me? And I'll find 1 out of 100 that can give me a sound definition of truth. And it's sad for me. Lewis said in a 1930 lecture to his students at Oxford University, we have fulfilled our whole duty to you if we can help you see some given tract of reality. To see the book for what it says, not for what you project on it. To draw out of it so that you can expand and grow, not learn to project yourself on the rest of the world. Truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. I have to have a real world, and I have to be able to think about that real world. There are knowers and there are objects to be known. This is a pen. That's true. Now I could call it anything. We have the word symbol, right? 2 Greek words, soon, with, and bale, to cast. I cast together 2 things, a word with one of these. So I don't have to have one of these to refer to in order to talk about it. So I could have called it a Gesortenblatt. But once I call it a pen in an English context, now I can have culture. I can have the community, because we're using the same words to describe these things. Lewis understood that truth had to have this connection. He writes a whole book about it, The Abolition of Man. I'll talk about it in just a moment. But we're in a world right now where people can think, well, you can be any gender you want. You can use any pronoun you want. It disassociates itself from reality. It puts emphasis on the person who's making the claim with no responsibility to the object or the world that they're describing. Lewis saw this as a problem and wrote a book about it, again, The Abolition of Man, and he depicted it in a horrifying book called That Hideous Strength, which is so prescient. It's describing our world as it is right now. But that reality, Lewis, as a faith-integrated author, he saw was infused with the very presence of God. You look out there, everywhere you look, in a world made by God, in a world peopled by God, with people who were created in his image, with creative abilities, everywhere you look is a call to worship, if you look at the world accurately. And consequently, this reality that we look at, Lewis says, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And so I think about this. There was a book that he wrote. It was actually the last book he published before he died. The two last books are I've got one of them with me, The Discarded Image, and Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. I think chapter 17 of Letters to Malcolm, in my opinion, is the best thing he wrote. And in that chapter, there's a paragraph. I'll recite it for you in a moment. But before I do, I want to define a word. And I don't define the word to insult your intelligence. You probably know this word, and it's probably used every day in your regular vocabulary. I had no clue what this word meant when I first read it back in, 1972 or something like that. And it was the word coruscation. Coruscation. A coruscation is a sudden flash of brightness. So I grew up in Southern California. I'd never seen a firefly in my life. I moved to Chicago, and we had fireflies coruscating in the back garden on a hot, humid summer evening. And they're just magical. I still am in awe of them. Or we could talk about the dark storm clouds moving our way and watching the lightning coruscating in the clouds. You get the idea of the word. And Lewis, making a distinction between gratitude and adoration or worship, says this: gratitude exclaims very properly, how good of God to give me this. But adoration asks, what must that being be like, whose far off and momentary coruscations are like this? In this revelation of reality at that moment, he's got a sense of awe and wonder about it. And when I read that, I started thinking, wow, this is remarkable. And it was right at the time when Voyager, the interplanetary probe, was speeding past Saturn, the most mysterious planet in our solar system, the one with rings. And I went to get my magazines. I still have my National Geographic. I wanted the pictures up close and personal, you know. And you know what they discovered at that time? The outer ring of Saturn is braided. They call it the F ring. And I'm saying, it's braided. Wow. Here's Lewis's question. What must God be like? Who, though no human eye had ever seen it, he chose to braid the outer ring of Saturn. I'm like you guys. I live in an academic world. I actually have friends who are physicists. And I say, why is it braided? And one of my friends who teaches at Wheaton used to teach at Oxford University. He says, Jerry, these are the things that keep us physicists up late into the night. But I shared it with a firefighting friend of mine about the outer ring of Saturn is braided. And he says, yeah, and we don't know if God didn't just braid it for the picture, like you would a little girl's hair. So I think of ships that park themselves over depths of the Pacific Ocean greater than the light of the sun can penetrate. And they dangle cameras into those depths, and they take pictures of fish painted neon bright. Why? Can't be to attract a mate. There's no sight down there. Matter of fact, how do those fish get together at those depths? That itself is an interesting question. And I just think to myself, wow, he painted fish neon bright in the bowels of the ocean, though no human eye had ever seen them. I think about growing up in Southern California. I love to see palm trees silhouetted against an auburn sunset sky, or a mountain range silhouetted against an auburn sunset sky. Now I live in the Midwest of the United States. A cornfield silhouetted against an auburn sunset sky. There's beauty there if we would willingly distill it out. But we could have lived on a black, dark planet and gotten word from on high there would be one sunrise and one sunset. We could have lined the coasts of all the continents and islands on our globe and regaled our progeny by writing about that great event. But what must God be like? That he has made our planet a perpetual kaleidoscope of sunrises and sunsets. To describe reality like that so our students start to get it and they go, wow, wow. One star twinkling in the night sky should be enough, I think, to awaken wonder in the mind and heart of every right-thinking, right-feeling individual. But what must God be like that he has glittered the night sky with stars and moons and galaxies and shooting stars? And I wish you could have been with me when I was teaching at Wheaton College's Northwoods campus up by Lake Superior near the Canadian border. And the students came knocking on my door at midnight and said, Jerry, they're out, they're out. And we went out and saw the northern lights in reds and blues and greens and whites pulsating and coruscating in the night sky. And you know what we did? We engaged in an act of justice. We stood on the ski dock and sang hymns of praise to God, because justice is to render to a thing its due. And we want our students to learn to render to the world they live in its due praise of God, to do these things. But what must God be like that he made delicate things? Butterflies, hummingbirds, peacock feathers. There's one that you can get off on for a while. But Lewis is too honest to let us stop there. He forces us also to ask, what must God be like that there are tsunamis in Japan, AIDS babies born in Africa, horrible things happening in earthquakes and whatnot in Haiti, or too many school shootings in America. Lewis says in a sermon he preached at Oxford called The Weight of Glory, if our religion is objective, we must never avert our eyes from those elements in it which seem puzzling or repellent, for it's precisely in the puzzling or repellent where we begin to discover what we do not yet know and need desperately to know. Lewis wants us to look at reality, to respond with our hearts and minds, and stay engaged with it so that we go deeper in our grasp and our understanding. This is his commitment to objective truth. And again, there's a reality there I'm responding to. So one time, my office was in the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College, a massive colonial building. I think it's the biggest colonial building in America. And I had to go to the restroom. I don't know what you call it in your country. Nobody rests there, I don't think. But anyway, I went to the restroom and I had to make a full deposit. So I was in the stall and I heard somebody come into the room. And I finished up my business. And I came out and there's a woman standing at the mirror fixing her makeup. And she just started berating me for being in the women's bathroom. Now, clearly, there is a conceptual difference between what we think about this room. And I won the argument with one word. I pointed and said, urinals. She screamed and ran out of the place. I've never seen her since, but their objective reality did not support her understanding. And Lewis is concerned that we understand the world that we live in. We don't always get it. Sometimes we have to go with probability, and so therefore opinion is based on probability rather than certainty. It's subject to doubt, and reasonable people can differ in matters of opinion, and Lewis makes these distinctions as well. One time he was giving a lecture at the Oxford Socratic Club. It was a club that he was the first president of. My doctoral supervisor was the vice president, and they would meet every week, and then when Lewis went to Cambridge, my doctoral supervisor, Basil Mitchell, was an eminent philosopher of religion at Oxford, and he Lewis was giving this lecture, and there was a relativist who was challenging him. They would have a Christian give a lecture, and the non-Christians would challenge it. The next week, a non-Christian would give a lecture, and the Christians would challenge it. And they kept this debate going. And this relativist said to Lewis afterwards, "How do you know there's not a blue cow on that piano right now?" And Lewis said, "Well, in what sense blue?" In other words, the claim means nothing if you have no reality to support the claim. And again, we don't always get to it, but even if we do, I think this is also important. Reality, Lewis said, this is the biggest idea in all of his books. I could take you to all of his books and show you where either Lewis addresses this as a concept or he addresses it explicitly. Reality is iconoclastic. Reality is iconoclastic. Whatever I know about the real world, I can always go deeper and I can always see more. You have this where it's not just in Lewis. Lewis says even about God, God always kicks out the walls of temples we build for him because he wants to give us more of himself. But Lewis isn't the only one who talks about these sorts of things. You go to Baron von Hugel, who was a philosopher of religion in England, and Lewis was taken by him. He sometimes quotes him and whatnot. And do you guys know Evelyn Underhill, this writer? Evelyn Underhill was a philosopher also in England. She taught at the University of London, and she wrote about 33 books. Actually, she wrote to Lewis. She was a contemporary of Chesterton's. She wrote to Lewis, and Lewis wrote her back and said, "Receiving that letter from you was the greatest literary experience of my life." It's amazing. So I got to Underhill through Lewis. But Underhill was a theist, and she fell under the spiritual direction of Baron von Hugel, and at the end she became decidedly Christian, and her later books are faith integrated, and Christ-centered. But von Hugel said in his letters to a niece, where he's doing spiritual direction with his niece, beware of the first clarity. Press on to the second clarity, or the third clarity. There's more. Robert Browning, similarly, if you're married, you should get this poem by him called Rabbi Ben Ezra. I read it to my wife every year on our anniversary. It's the one that begins, grow old along with me. The best is yet to be. But around 9:35, he says, then welcome each rebuff that turns earth's smoothness rough. We can think we have it all figured out. Everything's in its proper place. But the earth isn't smooth. It has texture. It has geography. It has peaks. It has valleys. Welcome the things that help you to see it the way that it is. As Lewis had said, we fulfilled our whole duty to you if we help you see some given tract of reality. Welcome the rebuff that helps you to see it the way that it is rather than the way you have to have it be. Matter of fact, ask yourself, why do you have to have it be that way? And then, by the way, Robert Browning wrote a book called The Ring in the Book. It's a 500-page poem. Lewis said it was one of his 10 best books. Of course, I had to read it. 500-page poem. Brilliant, brilliant work. And not only that, the whole book is basically reality is iconoclastic. Matter of fact, the last one, besides the letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, the last book Lewis wrote was A Discarded Image. And they were his prolegomena lectures at Oxford University on medieval and Renaissance literature. And he said that he's abstracting from all that literature that he read so well and coming up with this book. And he calls the medieval worldview a discarded image. It doesn't mean there aren't some things that transcend the time and move on into our time. But as a worldview, it had to be discarded because the world was more complex and was described by that worldview. And we should remember that our own worldview will become a discarded image one time. So the discarded image. But also, you've got Tennyson, his poem In Memoriam that he wrote after his best friend died. And he wrote it over several years. He said, writing about theology and theological systems, our little systems have their day. They have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they. All theology, Walter Elwell, the theologian, used to say, is approximation, and we're seeking better and better approximations. The history of the church is a history of councils, where they're refining their understanding. We're going to hear about it tonight, right, on the Council of Nicaea and so on. So this idea, reality is iconoclastic. Augustine, what does he say in the Confessions? The house of my soul is too small, O Lord. Enlarge it that you might enter in. And it seems to me that Lewis is helpful for us in this regard, his objective approach to truth. And I also think that Lewis helps us understand that you can have a sure word about something, but you never get a last word about anything. I can say, this is a pen. That's true. It's a sure word. There's an objective reality that supports a claim. But it's got a length. It's got a width. It's got a molecular structure. It's got a chemical compound for its ink. If Aristotle was here, he would say it has a formal cause. It has an efficient cause. It has a material cause. It has a final cause. How it writes on paper. How it writes on paper smeared with butter. Not very well. But this is a pen is a sure word that I can speak with confidence, but I should speak it with the open hand of humility because I haven't gotten to the bottom of it. And that's no threat. That means wonder is always around the corner. A sense of adoration, wonder, awe. And if I could begin to see the integration of God in that world which he had made, even when human creativity produces something like this, Tolkien says that we're made in the image of a creator. There's something of the expression of God's character even in human creativity. Okay, so then the fourth area, so we've got now academics can have reinforce what sound academics should always know by looking at Lewis. Sound academics can learn from C.S. Lewis' rhetorical style. Academics can learn from C.S. Lewis an objective approach to truth that gives me confidence and a sense of wonder. But also, fourth, academics can learn from C.S. Lewis faith-integrated approaches to the liberal arts. We live in a materialistic age where STEM studies seem now to dominate. STEM studies are great, but that's just part of the picture. And Lewis is a person who can appreciate the sciences, but he also wants to keep us informed by the integration, again, of faith and learning and a whole liberal arts approach to life. I had a student from Brown University. In America, Brown's one of our top universities, one of the Ivy League schools. Her best friend was a student of mine in a C.S. Lewis class at Wheaton College. And her best friend came to me and said, my best friend's coming to visit. Her spring break is different than ours. She's going to come spend a week with me. I'm going to bring her to class. She's an atheist, and she's a Brown University student. Could I bring her to class, and would you talk to her about spiritual things afterwards? I said, sure, bring her. That'd be great. So they come up after class, and I say, you've been friends since kindergarten? Tell me about that. It's not many people have friendships that go back that far. She said, you go to Brown University, you must be very bright. It's a very good university. What are you studying there? She says, biochemistry. I said, well, it's a challenging major. You're more intelligent than I even first suspected. I said, well, we talked about spiritual things in this class. What do you think? She says, frankly, as a biochemist, which I thought was a little premature, she was only a sophomore. As a biochemist, she said, I live by the principle, if I can't perceive it empirically, I just won't believe it. Okay, definition, let's make sure we're on the same page. You say if you can't perceive something empirically, you just won't believe it. Yep. I said, well, would you please set forth that principle empirically for me? I hope you see the problem. It's rationally perceived, and it's a contradiction too, and therefore it's not very good thinking. She freaked out when I said that to her. She never saw the inherent contradiction in her own principle. She said, why, everybody at Brown University believes this. I said, no, there's Christians at Brown University. You'd be surprised they kind of get everywhere. And then I said, plus, to be honest with you, I don't think all materialists would go as far as you went. And I said, don't get me wrong. I love the sciences. And I love what the engineers do to apply the sciences. So my life is better. I live in very cold Wheaton, Illinois. We have terrible winters. And I don't have to go out to an outhouse because we've got hydraulics in our house and we have flush toilets in our house. I like the way the scientists have studied these things and the engineers have applied it, and my life is better and easier. But John Polkinghorne, do you know that name? Physicist at Cambridge University. He's passed away now. Earned doctorates in physics and theology. President of one of the Cambridge University colleges and pastored a church at the same time. He said, if you ask the scientists, why is the kettle boiling? The scientists would say, from the measurable features, it's boiling because heat from the burner is agitating the molecules of the water and it burns at 100 degrees centigrade. So that's the answer the scientists could give you. But he said you could also answer it, I wanted a cup of tea and would you want one too? And the scientists couldn't give you the second answer by mere scientific investigation. Mortimer Adler, the philosopher who taught at University of Chicago for years, said in 4 generations we've gone from saying that which is important for science, that which is measurable, is now the only thing that's important. And consequently, something in our humanity dies when we have just that area. And I said to this woman, I love the university. I love the sciences, but that's only 1/4 of the university education. I love the social sciences too. I love the fact that we can have people research where people are at and what they're thinking about in this hour, because human society is fluid. We change. We want to understand our own time and our own day. I said, but I also love the fine arts. Mortimer Adler called them the useless arts. Not that they had no value, but they didn't have any utilitarian value per se. Everybody should be engaged in the fine arts at some level. Music, art, drawing, photography, whatever the case might be. Because God made us in the image of himself. He's a creator, and if we're not engaged in creativity at some level, we're not flourishing as humans as we ought to. And then I said, but I really love the humanities. The realm of philosophy, history, literature, and theology. We'll throw the queen of the sciences in there. theology. And I said to this woman, don't get me wrong, if you read philosophy, history, and theology, there'll be some ideas or some events in history or some books in literature that flare up like 4th of July fireworks and they dissipate into ash and you never hear about them again. But there are some things that keep percolating to the surface year after year, generation after generation. These are very human things. That's why we call them the humanities. And they show us that there's a complexity and a curiosity and a wonder about things we've longed to understand, and we continue to long to understand them better and better, generation after generation. And so consequently, this approach to truth and so on is, I think, central to Lewis. Fourth, academics can learn from C.S. Lewis' faith-integrated approach to liberal arts. Oh, that was the one I was talking about, because I was talking about this woman who, from Brown, was so myopic, just the STEM world. Lewis wrote this: most of my books are evangelistic. Well, most of his books are on medieval and Renaissance literature. And they're his best books, by the way. Most people don't read them. I produced a book called The Neglected C.S. Lewis, looking at 8 of these books and trying to introduce people to them. And it was an exercise in futility. If they're not reading those books because they're neglected by C.S. Lewis, they're not going to read the book about the neglected C.S. Lewis. So there you go. Anesthesiologists love it, though. Remember, they go that. So, but he said, most of my books are evangelistic. What did he mean when most of his books were on medieval and Renaissance literature? Well, he said later that we don't need more books by Christians about Christianity. We need more books by Christians with their Christianity latent, so that people are getting a whole big picture of a Christian worldview, and they're benefiting from that, and that's what Lewis was trying to do. This is a robust worldview because it's the true worldview. It's a worldview we get and develop as we approach God. This characterized Lewis's academic life, this faith integration, because it was also a feature of his private life as well. We see it in his personal life. There's a seamlessness in this integration between his personal life, his academic life, and his relationship with friends, and so on and so on. You'll see it in his letters. You'll see it in what he called his hot gospeling. He heard that the RAF airmen were dying in droves during the battle for Britain. He was invited to come and minister to the RAF airmen, and he went because they had souls and those souls mattered. And he wanted them to hear the gospel before they died. And I was talking to somebody recently who studied Lewis's involvement with the RAF, and I said, wow, so he's working all week doing tutorials, 20 tutorials a week at Oxford University, and he's going off on the weekends to speak at these things. He mustn't have had much time for himself. And this guy said, no. The chaplains were doing the weekend work. He would go lecture, and then he'd be on a train and doing his study while he's on the train to go to an air base to talk to the airmen. He allowed this to make encroachment on his personal life because he thought people mattered. You read The Weight of Glory. He says, you've never met a mere mortal. Every person you meet is an eternal soul, and they're on their way either to the miserific vision or the beatific vision. And the weight of glory is our responsibility to everybody we meet to help encourage them to come to faith. And Lewis did this, his hot gospeling. The Oxford Socratic Club that he started so he could be reaching his Oxford students. In his Royal Air Force book I mentioned too. Have any of you read many of his letters? There was one guy, Paul Ford, who took all the letters that had like some sort of spiritual direction in them and put them together in a book called Yours, Jack. And Jack was his nickname. I don't like it when people call him that, though. It sounds like they're too familiar. Have you ever heard people say, well, Jack Lewis, and I go, oh, did you know him? Did you know him? Why is it? Nobody calls Shakespeare Willie. Nobody calls Milton Johnny Boy or Chaucer Jeffy. Why do we do this? I don't know. Is there an insecurity that we want to act like we know him more than we do? Even Basil Mitchell, my doctoral supervisor, he had lunch with him every week during term. He said he never jacked me. was always Lewis and Mitchell. So that sometimes we can engage in practices that cultivate a kind of arrogance, I think, if we're not careful. But anyway, fifth, academics can learn from C.S. Lewis a use of the imagination. And I think this is important. This is where it comes to depiction. He wrote, "The imaginative man in me is older than the rational man and more continually operative than the rational man." He had a sound mind. He was a great logician and so on. But it was Lewis's imagination that really prompted his quest for truth. When he was young, he said, "I never saw a beautiful building. I had absence of beauty characterized my childhood." It's interesting, he said he had never been in a beautiful building. I've been all through his boyhood home. It's one of the most spectacular homes I've ever seen. He grew up in Belfast, Ireland. I don't know if you've been there or not, but it's an incredibly beautiful city. And he had the Hollywood Hills and the Castlereagh Hills around him and so on. And when I read that, I never saw a beautiful building. When I went into his boyhood home, I was going, what was he talking about? He said he never saw beauty till his brother brought in a toy garden on the lid of a cookie tin. And he said that awakened in me a sense of beauty. He said what all real gardens failed to do to me, that did to me. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that there wasn't beauty around him. It means that there was not an awakening moment for him. But when the awakening moment came, we have to believe that maybe God was in that moment. Have any of you been to an art museum where you pass hundreds of paintings on the wall? And they're interesting. But then all of a sudden you come to one painting and you can't pull yourself away from it. For me, that painting was Van Gogh's Cypresses in the Wheat Field at the National Gallery in New York City, or the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And I'm standing in front of it, and you can see the amber waves of grain, the turbulence in the clouds. It's almost like the wind is blowing off that painting and affecting you. And I'm standing there, and I was with my wife and another professor at Wheaton, Mark Lewis, and his wife Mary, and I realized finally that I'd been standing in front of that painting for about a half hour. And I realized other people were trying to get up to it, and I was hogging the best spot. So I felt embarrassed, and I backed up, and I backed into a bench, bolted to the floor. I don't know who put the bench there, but I was grateful. And then I realized after another 20 minutes, like, wait a minute, where are Mark and Mary and my wife, Claudia? And you know how museums have those wide doors that go from room to room? I look this way, I don't see them. I look that way, I don't see them. You know what else I didn't see? A bench. Enough people must have had that experience with that painting. They put a bench there to benefit the ones that wanted to linger longer. Now I've been back many times, and now there's benches all over the place in that room. But nevertheless, have you had that experience? I used to do work behind the Iron Curtain, teaching in these underground schools years ago. And I was for a month behind the Iron Curtain one time without my family. I was homesick. I was weary. I was interrogated by the secret police in Romania for 6 to 8 hours. It was not a comfortable experience. And I just wanted to get out of here. I wanted to get home. I felt my heart broke for the people in Eastern Europe who were suffering under those regimes. I could leave. They had to stay. And I came finally to Prague. And I had, after that month, a half a day all to myself. And I remember wandering up the hill to where the castle is, to St. Vitus Cathedral. And I walked in, and the third window on the left, the window by Alphonse Mucha telling the history of how Christianity first came to the Slavic people. And I've never seen such vibrancy of color in a window before in my life. And I go, oh my heavens. Just seeing that painting was a liberal arts education. And I sat before it. I've been back to that painting probably 14 times over the years just to see it. Have you all had experiences like that? Lewis had one, a toy garden. And it awakened in him a sense to be able to appreciate all the gardens after that. And consequently, too, Lewis had his imagination awakened. He longed for beauty. But what was he longing for? What was the beauty that he longed for? And he describes it as joy, or the German word Sehnsucht, or sweet desire, the quest to find the object of his longing. Just as we have an observer in reality, and the observer, the subject, looking for the object to find truth, we can find truth too in something about the supernatural. And Lewis was questing for this and trying to understand it, and he had to depict it imaginatively. Now, everybody knows that the imagination is a prompt to the quest for truth, right? What is a scientific method? How does it begin? With a hypothesis. That's an imaginative depiction. And if we experiment, we discover that maybe the hypothesis is accurate. How do we describe what we've discovered? We use models. We depict them imaginatively. And Lewis picked this up. And while he was questing for the object of his great desire, he fell under the falsehood of materialism. And basically, the materialist said, lovers don't love. A man looks at a woman, she projects an image on the retina of his eye, series of electrical synapses travels along the optic nerve, stimulates the brain, causes secretion of particular hormones. He says it's love. It's not love. It's just chemistry. That's all it is. And Lewis says, then these longings for whatever awaken with beauty, that's just chemistry too, and there's nothing to it. And then Lewis, who is too smart to stay in one place because reality is iconoclastic, he said, but if the materialist wants me to believe that his description is accurate, didn't he just look at the lovers? They projected an image on his retina through a series of electrical synapses. It traveled along his retina. It traveled along his optic nerve and stimulated his brain, caused the secretion of particular hormones. And he said reality, when in fact he was no more valid than the lovers were. And he says, I can't believe reason is mere cerebral biochemistry. It doesn't fit the definition, and you can't think about it in a reasonable way. And he goes, if that's true, then maybe these longings are real. Maybe somebody is wooing me. Maybe there is an object to my deepest longing. And so that started Lewis on this quest, but he's trying to understand it. So how does he get his mind around it? He's got to engage in some imaginative depiction because it's beyond his present understanding. He talks about the fact that we have the pupil's metaphor. I don't understand it, so I cast a metaphor. Maybe it's like this. I look at it. Eventually I can come to what he calls the master's metaphor, where you do understand the concept and you're creating an imaginative depiction for your students. So Lewis said, after he had reasoned his way through the morass of atheism and its supporting worldview, materialism, after he reasoned his way through agnosticism, and he reasoned his way through the Christian or the religious options that were out there, he said, I think the Christian option needs to be the right one, but I don't think I could know God personally any more than Hamlet could know Shakespeare. There's his pupil's metaphor. And then he had a late night talk with Tolkien. And Tolkien talked to him about the imaginative understanding of these things. And Tolkien got Lewis fired up. And Lewis came back and revisited his imaginative depiction. And he said, if Hamlet could ever get to know Shakespeare, Hamlet, the character in the play, couldn't break outside of the play to get to know the author. But Shakespeare, the author, could have written himself into the play as Shakespeare, the character, and made the introduction possible. He says, I think that's what happened in the Incarnation. And 2 weeks later, he becomes a Christian. But it was through the imagination he moved in that direction to a full understanding. 6, academics can learn from C.S. Lewis personal integrity and courage. He said you have to follow the truth wherever it led. And for him, it led from his atheism. Actually, it led him into atheism. His mother died when he was 9. People in his church had said, you pray for her, she'll get better. You can't give that assurance to a child. He prayed for her as if his 9-year-old prayers were what was keeping her alive, and she died. And he goes, this is a crock. I think it was Arnold Toynbee said, most people don't reject Christianity, they reject a poor caricature of Christianity. And Lewis's understanding of reality is, that is not real. So he left. He became an atheist, like I said. But atheism couldn't sustain him because he saw it also was incongruous. So he followed the truth wherever it led. It led him to his atheism, but it also led him back to Christianity once again. And when he became convinced of theism, even before he was a Christian, Lewis felt it was important to fly one's flag. You read his letters, and he says, I'm a theist now, and I started attending chapel because I felt one should fly his flag. How many times have you met academics that their subculture is very secular, and they're not flying their flag? Now, we can be obnoxious, and if you're obnoxious, then of course, it's not that you're flying your flag, you're being obnoxious. People are getting turned off. But if your faith is real and you're an academic, you should be able to be thinking about these things, answering the objections, and answering them in a winsome way that woos and wins, but not back off. It should be the integrating feature of your life. Lewis was that way. He flew his flag, even when he became a theist. But then when he became a Christian, that's when he started doing all this Christian work. And he got castigated for it. Some people think that he never got his professorship at Oxford because people were against him for being a Christian. He wrote more academic books than any of the other people who were of his time, but he was marginalized. And it wasn't just because he was a Christian. There were some other features as well. But nevertheless, he wasn't afraid to fly his flag. And as academics, we need to do that. And if we do it with, look at the Marxists who are in universities. I don't know how it is in your country, but in America, it's invasive. They're flying their flag, and maybe they're getting attention because Christians haven't been flying their flag. Lewis flew his flag. Seventh, academics can learn from C.S. Lewis a capacity for sound dialogical engagement with other academics. There was a man named E.M.W. Tilliard who wrote a book on Milton, literary criticism on Milton. And Lewis disagreed with what he said. He said Milton is not about anything but the state of the author's mind when he wrote. And Lewis wrote a rebuttal to that in Essays and Studies, a literary critical journal that's put out by Oxford University. He wrote a response. Lewis says, if it's the state of the author's mind, how do you interpret a book like Beowulf? Well, we don't know who wrote it. How do you interpret a dramatist's play when he's got words spoken from all different perspectives? Lewis said, I don't think you're right. I think the book is about something. Let's look at the book. It goes back to what he said to those students. We fulfilled our whole duty to you if we help you see some given tract of reality. And so the next year, Tilliard wrote a response. The next year in the journal, Lewis wrote a response. And they said, this is pretty good. How about if we do a book? And it is a marvelous work in academic debate and dialogue. You won't find an ad hominem in that book. You won't find an informal. I have had a hard time. There might be some I've skipped over, but you won't find straw man arguments. You won't find hypothesis contrary to fact, sweeping generalizations, and so on. And it's a great work of academic demonstration of how two academics could be involved over a difference of opinion and debate the difference of opinion in a way that produces light and not heat. And also the Oxford Socratic Club would be another example. And then I would say one last one that's not in your notes that I gave you, one more. The quest for knowledge for Lewis about reality is, at the end of the day, a quest for virtue. A quest for virtue. If you go to the trivium and the quadrivium in the medieval approach to the liberal arts, the goal was that the education would produce virtue in the students. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. Virtue, of course, is the habit of courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. These were not an end. These were a means to the end. The means were the end of the good life, the happy life, the fulfilled life. For the Christian, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Lewis, it would be the God-glorifying life, and it would be the life that basically leads to human flourishing. So that would be probably one more I would add to Lewis. So I've got one point I meant to make on the imagination. Is it okay? George MacDonald said, "We do not have souls. We are souls. We have bodies." You tell a child he has a soul, he thinks when he dies, he goes to his grave and his soul goes off someplace else. Tell the child, no, he is a soul, and when he dies, he leaves his body behind like clipped hair on a barber shop floor, for those of you that still go to barbers. And he goes off to heaven. He is a soul. Now, I've read a lot of books on the soul. I think I could set forth proofs for the existence of the immaterial part of what it is to be human, and convincing proofs. But traditionally, we've said the soul has a rational part, thinking. It has a feeling part, the emotion, and it has a choosing part, the volition. I want to suggest to you, coming from an academic world, and you guys probably sense the same thing, that the reason is hands down the weakest of those three. If I make a bad choice, my reason doesn't kick in and say, Jerry, that was a foolish decision. That's just going to hurt you, and it's going to hurt the people around you. No, my reason being weak is marshaled by my will to make excuses for that bad choice. Aristotle had a term for it. He called it akrasia, or akrasia. Akrasia is the Greek word for command. Put the alpha negation, I lose command of my moral life when I've rationalized my bad behavior. And then also, if I'm hurt emotionally, my reason doesn't kick in and say, boy, Jerry, you need to grieve what was done to you. You need to forgive the person who hurt you so you can move past that hurt spot. No, my reason being weak encapsulates that wound in some sort of cyst on my soul, and it fills with pus, and you bump into me, and I bleed a little pus towards you, and so on. The bitterness sets in. Anne Lamott, you know, the English American writer, she said, bitterness is like you drinking the rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. You know, you just get to that place where you need to mend and heal. My reason could be guiding me through that, but often my reason just keeps it all suppressed and so on. And Lewis says that reason stands like dragon sentries before my heart. How do I get past the dragon sentries and get to the heart to help me to see it, life the way that it is, rather than the way I have to have it be because of all the compromises I may have made? And Lewis says sometimes story gets past the watchful dragon. Now we know that as Christians, right? David has committed adultery. He's murdered to cover it up. And you're the prophet Nathan, and God says, I want you to go tell him. And you know he's already murdered once. That's a pretty spooky assignment, isn't it? How does Nathan get through? He tells a story. He does it tangentially. Jesus says he lives in a world where people had eyes but could not see. They had ears but they could not hear. So what does he do to get through to them? He tells stories, parables, and so on. And so consequently, the life of the imagination becomes very, very important in that regard. And it just goes back to this concept already that we've talked about.